Good morning, everyone. It's June 1st. Good time of year to be reading The Fields of Home. And we'll read chapter 23 today. It's entitled, The Colt and I Become Friends. That must mean the yellow colt. Wow. Chapter 23. There had been a big piece of corned beef in one of the packages Uncle Levi gave me to bring down to the farm. The first thing I did after Grandfather drove away was to fry myself 4 eggs and put the corned beef on to boil. When I was finishing the chores, taking the cows to pasture, it boiled dry and burned black on the bottom. Ugh. Before I left for the high field, I scraped some of the black off the meat and filled the kettle with water. Then I crammed the stove full of hardwood, closed the dampers so it would keep cooking most of the forenoon. The yellow colt fought me again that morning when I harnessed him, and he raised Cain during the first hour in the field. He got a leg outside one of the traces after I thought he was all settled down. The traces are part of the harness. They go back to do the actual pulling on the machine. Without thinking, I stepped forward to make him put his foot back in, and he kicked quicker than a flash of lightning. His hoof spanked sharply on my thigh, just above my knee. If I'd have been a few inches closer, I might have broken my leg. I grabbed up the line ends to beat him with them, but stopped myself. It wouldn't have done any good. It would only have made him hate me worse. Instead, I kept him working hard all the rest of the morning, with only rest enough to keep from hurting his wind. I thought I would have some corned beef for my dinner, but I didn't. The fire had burned out when I went to the house at noon. The beef was as tough as whang leather. Oh, the water around it looked like strong black coffee. It was as bitter as walnut husks. I drained it off, put on fresh water, then built up the fire and fried myself 4 more eggs. The colt worked pretty well during the afternoon. I didn't have to wire his ears together once, but he was sulky, kept his head turned just enough that he could keep an eye on me all the time. Except for the couple of times I ran to the house to put more wood on the fire, I kept him working hard. By the time Annie came for her cows, he was plodding as steadily as old Nell would have. I let him stand in his traces when I went to the brow of the hill to wave to her. I didn't get down to the valley, but Annie called up to me, "Are you sure there isn't anything I could do to help you around the house? Couldn't I make the beds and help out with the cooking?" I wanted to say yes, but I remembered how crabby Grandfather had been when he thought I'd gone into his room. So I called back, "I've got a big piece of corned beef on cooking for supper. The beds only take a few minutes, so I guess we'll be all right, but thank you anyway." I went back to the yellow colt, started him for the barn, and went for our cows. Without the calves to bother them, they were waiting at the pasture bars and lowed for the milking when they saw me coming. Grandfather hadn't come home when I had the barn chores finished. The milk put away in the cellar, and the potatoes on to boil. The corned beef was fairly tender by then, so I put the pot onto the back of the stove and went out to wait for him. He hadn't taken old Bess with him that morning. It was a bright starlight evening, so I blew out the lamp, and Bess and I sat on the doorstone, waiting. I must have been more tired than I realized. I didn't wake up till old Bess raised her head quickly from my lap. There was a slow clump of a horse's feet coming up the driveway, and a squeak now and then of wagon wheels. When I got up, Nell was coming slowly past the side of the house. Her head was hanging low, and against the light of the sky, I could see Grandfather's outline on the wagon seat. His head was low too. He was hunched over enough that I thought he was asleep. I called, "Hi, Grandfather," to wake him, but he didn't answer. As I ran to the wagon, he raised his head slowly and said, "Couldn't find a trace of a no place, Ralphie. Your old grandpa's all tuckered out. He's been hunting for Millie." "I've got some good supper cooked," I told him. "You'll feel better after you've eaten. I'll take care of old Nell while you get washed up. There's hot water on the stove." "Gory, I'd be a little wary," was all he said as he climbed down over the wheel and sort of stumbled toward the doorway. I had just pulled the harness off Nell when Grandfather called me angrily from the house. Oh, jeez, he's mad again about something, isn't he? "What in time and tarnation you been up to whilst I've been gone?" he shouted as he came out of the barn. "What's all them eggshells a doing in the swill pail?" What did you ruin the meat for? I didn't ruin the meat, I said as I went toward the house. Those are just shells from the eggs I had for breakfast and dinner. There wasn't anything else to eat. Plenty pork in the barrel, want there? Plenty potatoes in the bin. Don't be so choosy about your victuals. Eggs is 18 cents a dozen. Then, without waiting for me to get to the house, he stomped off to his room and slammed the door. While I'd been sleeping on the doorstone, the corned beef had burned and the burnt taste had cooked all the way through the piece. Hungry as I was, I couldn't swallow any of it without gagging. I bet. The potatoes had boiled to a porridge of mush and skins. I strained out some of the best of it, ate it, drank some milk, and went to bed. I expected Grandfather to be cross the next morning, but he wasn't. When he called me, his voice seemed cheerful. And when I went down to the kitchen, he had flour scattered all over the back pantry. Whacking us up a nice mess of biscuits, Ralphie, he called to me. Ain't nothing better of a morning than nice good hot biscuits and new honey. Got a busted comb out to the bee shop. I'll pop these biscuits in the oven and fetch it whilst you're at your chores. Come running once they're hot. I came running when Grandfather hollered, but the biscuits weren't the best. They were dead brown all over, as hard as rocks and not over an inch high. Oh, my word. Curious, ain't it? Grandfather said as he pulled them out of the oven. Must be the tannel saleratus was damp, or the milk wasn't sour enough. Curious. Oh, well, what's the odds? I got to attend an auction over the other side of Lisbon Village. But I'll whack you up a nice mess of biscuits for your dinner before I go. Now you run on, finish your chores, while I cook us a kettle of porridge. The oatmeal wasn't burned that morning, but it wasn't half cooked either. And there were some hard lumps in it. Ate a few mouthfuls, drank some milk, took the cows to pasture. Grandfather was down at the beehives when I came back to harness the horses. I didn't get down, but slipped into the kitchen through the woodshed. I couldn't pick stones all forenoon without something more to eat. I boiled 4 eggs good and hard, put them in my pocket, took the yellow colt to the high field. The colt bucked only once all morning, and most of the time he kept watching me. He laid his ears back whenever I went near him. I carried a stout stick on the stone rake and never went past his heels so I didn't have it ready to swing at them. I almost hoped he would kick at me so I'd be able to teach him a lesson he'd remember, but he didn't lift a foot. After each trip across the field and back, I let the old horse rest a few minutes by the orchard wall. From there, I could see Grandfather at the beehives, and changed a bit from the way he was doing things before he'd sent me home. As soon as the mailman came, he went to the box, into the house for a couple of minutes, then drove away. Maybe drove away with a horse and buggy. When the yellow colt and I left the high field at noon, we had half of it raked. On the part we'd done since I'd come back, the stones lay in even rows across the ground, like gray stripes on a big piece of brown cloth. The raking hadn't been very hard work for me, but it had been awfully hard for one horse. For the last hour of the morning, the colt plodded along with its head as low as the check rein would let it hang. At the barn, I took his harness off, wiped the sweat from his belly and legs, gave him an extra quart of bran. I knew I had him worked down enough so he wouldn't give me any more trouble, and I was a little ashamed of myself for fear I'd worked so old a horse too hard. When I went into the kitchen, I found the second batch of biscuits Grandfather had baked on the back of the stove. They were still in the pan, were cold, and no higher than the first ones. The only difference was these were white where the others had been brown. The only reason they weren't as hard was because they were half raw. My word. I tried to eat one, but couldn't. There was nothing else in the house except oatmeal, raw potatoes, and salt pork. Grandfather had taken every last egg with him when he drove away. After I put potatoes on to boil, I went hunting hen's nest. Altogether, I found 9 eggs, boiled them while the potatoes cooked, and hid them in the barn for a time when I need them. Then I fried pork, sat down at the table. While I was eating, I got an idea how to save myself a lot of work in unloading the stones. When I went back to the high field, I took along a heavy piece of chain with a hook on it and the ropes and pulleys from the horse fork. After I'd hauled the first drag load of stones close to the orchard wall, I climbed over, fastened one of the pulleys to the trunk of an apple tree. It happened to be an August sweet tree. The apples were just beginning to turn yellow, and I was still hungry, so I ate one. It was sweet and good. Before I went back to the field, I filled my pockets with apples. The yellow colt either smelled them or saw me chewing. He turned his head toward me and snickered softly. In all my life, I'd never been around any horse long without loving him, but I'd almost hated the yellow colt right from the first day. If I hadn't been ashamed of myself for working him too hard, I would probably have remembered his kicking me. I would still have been peeved at him when he snickered. Instead, I thumped one of the apples on a stone to crack it, then held the pieces up on my palm for the old horse to eat. He picked them off carefully with his lips, stood rubbing his nose against me as he ate them. Now, there's a picture of that, what's happening. Feeding the horse apples. Ha! There's a part of a stone wall under the apple tree. Ha! Let's see, where was I here? As he chewed, I scratched his forehead and said, "You haven't had any brands burn or fields go back to the wilderness, have you? What makes you so crabby? Did your mother spoil you when you were little? Have you got horse malaria? They say people grow alike from living together. Is that what ails you? I'll bet if you'd been my colt from the day you were born, you'd never have grown up to be so ornery." I fed the colt 4 apples, and ate 2 myself, before I went back to the tackle. All the time I was fussing with him, he kept rubbing his nose against me and nickering quietly. Of course, I knew he was only asking for more apple, but it almost sounded as if he were trying to answer me. With the last piece of the 4th apple, I told him, "I'll be friends if you will. I won't tie your ears together again until I know for sure you don't want to be friends anymore." I wasn't too positive the tackle idea would work. With one pulley fastened to a tree trunk in the orchard, I brought the double ropes across the top of the stone wall, hitched the chain to the pulley on the opposite end, and slipped the hook under the far edge of the stone drag. If a horse could pull hard enough, I thought the drag would skid sideways till it was against the wall, then turn up on its side and dump the load. If everything went right, it would save nearly half my work. I planned to give the yellow colt a little slack on the tote rope, then rush him hard into the pull. For some reason, I didn't want to do it that way after I'd fed in the apples. I wanted to see if he'd do it for me on a pull that he wasn't sure he could make. Not very many bulky horses will stay with a pull if they think it's too much for them. When everything was ready, I hooked the old horse's single tree to the tote rope, led him forward till the rope lifted off the ground, and stopped. Then I looped the reins over his hame knob, and went back, leaned against the wall. I didn't make a sound till he'd turned his head to see where I was, what I was doing. I wanted him to know I wasn't near enough to hit him. I didn't have hold of the reins. As his head turned toward me, I clucked, just twice, about 2 seconds apart. Like that. The yellow colt stepped forward, leaned a little into the collar, and felt the load with his shoulders. He didn't slack off, but turned his head again, as if he were trying to tell me it was too heavy. I didn't move, but clucked twice more. On the second cluck, the knots of muscle began raising along his haunches and thighs. He crouched a little, and his hind hoofs sank deeper into the soft ground. Inch by inch, the heavily loaded stone drag began to skid sideways. The edge met the wall, and slowly, the far side began to lift from the ground. When I looked back at the yellow colt, his neck was bowed, every sinew in his legs was taut as a harp string, his ears were pointed straight ahead. I could hardly wait for the drag to tip clear up and spill its load. My fists were clenched, and my own muscles pulled till they ached. Before the rumble of stones faded, I called, "Whoa!" to him and ran to his head. I wasn't even ashamed that tears were running down my face, as I told him I'd never fight him again. He was always going to be my horse. Wow, huh? It's the end of that chapter. We'll read another one, chapter 24, I hope tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.